At last, a voice for the people who pay big government bills, not the people who make big government bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And I'm your co-host, Doug Kellogg.
Welcome to this week's broadcast.
Well, thank you for taking a step away from March Madness this weekend to listen to the podcast. It's a lot of madness going on for taxpayers lately. We've had 2 weeks with our CPAC podcast airing, so we've been away for a little while. First thing is, on the good side, is a balanced budget amendment taking further steps in the states.
Yes, the state of Tennessee has now joined 21 other states in calling for an Article 5 limited convention to propose and draft a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution that would bind the federal government. Basically, such an amendment would require federal outlays and revenues to balance in a given year unless an extraordinary majority of members of Congress decided to approve a specific amount of deficit spending. Many of the versions of the amendment have a tax limitation clause in them. By pressuring Congress with these resolutions, we hope to either get Congress to act first, or, if such an assembly is convened, get an amendment sent out to the regular ratification process of the states. I mean, that's the important thing here. All the convention can do is what Congress can do under its amendment power. 2/3 of them call the assembly, they draft the amendment, and then it goes through regular ratification. So we're thankful that Tennessee has done its job. We now have about a dozen more states to go to force this issue to be confronted one way or another, and we better do it soon.
This issue is really gaining steam, and it's probably not surprising, as we'll talk to Deroy Murdock a little bit, syndicated columnist, about debt, and we've seen the Ryan Murray budget take steps backwards on reducing government spending, so somebody has to take steps forward, and right now it's happening in the states. Also, a couple items of interest on the state level, which hopefully we'll get to spend a little more time on in the future, but worth knowing about right now. On the madness side, Maryland and New York considering death tax relief, not repeal. And also on the positive side, Governor Walker is scheduled to sign into effect on Monday morning further about $500 million in tax cuts, yes, which we discussed a little bit in recent podcasts with our state affairs manager, Lee Schock. So $500 million in tax relief for Wisconsin coming on Monday, and notably on property and for middle class, and working class folks.
Yeah, not a bad deal. Of course, lots of states need to be more aggressive in reforming their tax systems, simplifying them, perhaps even getting rid of their income taxes altogether. There are, after all, 9 states that do not have broad-based income taxes. 7 of them have no income tax of any kind. So this is not an unprecedented move. Lots of big places like Florida and Texas do without income taxes, and they prosper as a result.
And also on the more depressing side of the madness is what's going on in the Ukraine, and we certainly don't talk about foreign policy, but with our taxpayer friends in the Ukraine, Pete and Dwayne were there a couple of years ago for the World Taxpayers Association conference. We made a nice video congratulating them on an anniversary this winter, so definitely our thoughts are with them.
Yeah, and a very interesting article by one of our colleagues, Veronique Derugi, who was discussing how the U.S. Export-Import Bank actually helped to benefit Russia with some of its lending policies. And it just is another reminder of how so many current events can be intertwined with various government institutions that work against U.S. taxpayers.
Yeah, these are things I think we've actually talked about before in the Outrage of the Week, at least some of the EXIM loans for certain. And this is National Review Week on the podcast because she wrote this article for National Review Online, which you should definitely check out with some input from interesting stats from Heritage Action. So really well-written article that gives you some insight into how our federal government is funneling money through the Export-Import Bank, through our tax dollar, which is supported and backed by our tax dollars, funneling money through to foreign countries, in this case Russia, to buy airplanes and things like that, and primarily airplanes, primarily Boeing aircraft actually, and that effect can have unintended consequences down the line right now, where you have our tax dollars backing activity that sends money through Russia. We are very thrilled to have joining us today on Speaking of Taxpayers, Deroy Murdock, Fox News contributor and syndicated columnist. He wrote a really interesting piece on nationalreview.com entitled The National Debt Now, where he reviews some of the urgent problems that we're facing because of the debt, and warns against the sort of putting it off rhetoric that we hear a lot. So welcome to the podcast, Deroy.
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you.
So as you start off at the beginning of the piece, you talk about how there are a lot of Americans who don't have children, and we hear rhetoric about how the debt, it's going to affect the children. But you point to the problems with that argument, and then also point to the problems that we're facing with the national debt right now.
Correct. If you put on your TV or go to any political rally, you're going to hear people say, the national debt's a terrible thing. We don't want to pass these bills along to our children and grandchildren, so on and so on. We've heard this over and over for years. I think it's completely hackneyed and cliche. And it is a problem that kids and grandkids down the road are going to have to cope with this $17.4 trillion national debt. But there are two problems with that rhetoric. First is that there are many, many, many millions of Americans who don't have kids. And so if you're running for president, running for Senate, running for U.S. House, what have you, and you talk about this, there are a lot of people who hear it, it just goes right past them. The Census Bureau did some research, and I had worked with them, and they put together some figures for me. And the most recent data are from 2009. And at that point, if you talked about the children, a full 71 million Americans, or 31.3% of adults between 18 and 88, didn't have kids. Now, a lot of those are younger people who might eventually settle down and have children. But even people up to age 50, that number is a grand total of about 15 million Americans who by age 50 don't have kids, and at that point they probably won't. And so I think it's very important to talk about the problems not just down the road for kids and grandkids, but people who are suffering today, people who don't have kids, who are not, that rhetoric doesn't register with them, and then people today who are suffering. And the real problem is not the dangers of the national debt 20 or 30 years from now when the kids grow up, but people are suffering right now in March 2014 with high unemployment, low growth, and so on. And the reason for this is that Uncle Sam basically, in order to pay off and pay the interest on $17.4 trillion in the national debt, goes to the banks, borrows money, and once Uncle Sam has cleared out the money hit the bank, it's almost like Bonnie and Clyde coming through. There's very little left over for everyone else. Corporations have AAA credit ratings. They're done okay in terms of borrowing money. But the money we've seen, the credit we've seen extended to the major sectors of the economy basically has seen corporations do okay with about a 25% increase in their borrowing. The people in small business have seen between 2008 and end of 2013 about a 2.2% increase in the money they've borrowed. Households have seen a decline of 5% over that period. And big government, surprise, surprise, has grabbed most of that money with a 66% increase in the amount of money that it's borrowed between December 31, 2008 and New Year's Eve 2013. So the damage is not down the road. The damage is right now with Uncle Sam grabbing up so much available capital that crowds out money that could be made available for new inventions, new companies, hiring people, promoting people, training people, and people are suffering in this country right now today because of the national debt, not in 15 or 20 years when little Johnny and little Sally grow up.
Yeah, this is the shocking point, I think, that your article makes so well, Deroy, and that it's almost as if, to borrow a bad line from a Jimi Hendrix song, we woke up this morning and we found ourselves dead. It's like all of a sudden we had been saying this for decade after decade that, our children and grandchildren are going to be paying down the line. Well, the borrowing has been going on that long, and now we are in a terrible situation. We've suddenly awakened to the fact that there are very real consequences to our borrowing right now. We kind of had a warning from, I believe it was Congressional Budget Office back in 2009 when the stimulus was being passed. And granted, the CBO was sort of trying to be, not biased in its assumptions, saying that the stimulus package might have some short-term effect, but within a matter of a few years, the benefits would be outweighed by the costs in terms of the debt service and the crowding out effect that the borrowing behind the stimulus would exert on the economy. Well, gee, it is for almost 5 years since the stimulus package. Actually, it is 5 years since the stimulus passed, and all of those effects are coming home to roost. So what is it going to take to awaken people to the fact that they are already living this debt problem?
Well, I don't know what it takes for people to recognize the connection between the two. I mean, I think people understand the economy is very sluggish. Unemployment's at, 6.6%. It should be much lower than that. We're growing at about 2% a year, which is positive, but barely. It's kind of like, if you're at home in bed on a Sunday with a throbbing hangover, you're not dead, but you're not feeling very good either. And this has been like a 5-6 year hangover this country's had. And I think people in politics, people in journalism, people in the think tank movement, political activists, et cetera, need to talk about this and educate people on the connection between huge national debt, federal borrowing, and Uncle Sam basically grabbing up the available cash, if you will, hogging down everything on the smorgasbord table and leaving a couple croutons and a little bit of salad for everybody else to nibble on and expect us to be happy about it. Well, expect us to thank him for it, which is usually the case. And you don't see it slowing down. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, after all this spending, Obama said, look, we need $302 billion for additional infrastructure spending. I thought we did that already 5 years ago with the stimulus. Wasn't that to cover infrastructure spending? And now we're going to do more. And we spent something like $833 billion in the stimulus. It didn't stimulate very much. And at least if we'd gotten some roads and bridges and tunnels repairs that wouldn't collapse, we could say, all right, we got some value out of that. But I didn't see much of that happen. And a lot of that money was sopped up for reducing the red ink on the balance sheets of states that had high deficits. A whole lot of it went into hiring federal employees. A lot of that went into Solyndra and these other green companies that then very politely went ahead and went bankrupt, so we didn't get very much value out of that. So all this spending is going on. It's hurting the economy. We're getting very little of value of it, and at least it would slow down or stop. That would be improvement, but it would be an improvement, but I just see it continuing and accelerating. And the GOP in Congress should be screaming bloody hell over this. And I hope they do on the campaign trail this fall.
Yeah, that's kind of important. And unfortunately, one thing that might impede some of these folks in the GOP from screaming about it on the campaign trail has been, well, their complicity in all of this borrowing. We were talking just prior to this broadcast of Speaking of Taxpayers about the fact that we've seen letdown after letdown from the GOP in terms of their interactions with President Obama. I guess the high point was in 2011 when the Budget Control Act was signed, at least there, in exchange for an increase in the national debt. We obtained caps on part of the federal budget, the so-called discretionary spending part, and a little bit of mandatory spending, but they undid those caps in the Ryan Murray budget agreement and added insult to injury in the 2014 Consolidated Appropriations Act, the Farm Bill, this whole flood insurance debacle. What in the world is going on with these folks, especially in a campaign year?
Yeah, Pete, it astonishes me and depresses me very much to watch this happen. As you say, the GOP caved in on the Ryan Murray budget. These permanent caps turned out to be like Pop-Tops, flip right off and disappear. We had the increase in the national debt limit without any attendant cuts in spending, or even what I favored, which was give the president the increase in the debt limit, but attached to it a very simple line saying that the Obamacare bailout of the health insurance companies would be repealed, and if they were stupid enough to get in bed with Obama on Obamacare, they would suffer the consequences, not the American taxpayer. That'll probably cost $47 billion when Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Kaiser, Aetna, Cigna, et cetera, start seeing their bottom lines implode once the death spiral on Obamacare begins. and people listening to this broadcast are going to be on the hook for that rather than those private companies. Any of those things would have given a little bit of quid for the pro quo of what was given to Obama. Instead, it's just it's a never-ending Christmas morning. Whatever Obama wants, he gets delivered by the GOP in exchange for nothing, which I find astonishing and highly frustrating. And I wish these guys would grow a backbone or whatever other appropriate part of the anatomy required to stand up to Obama and at least say, look, all right, you'll get what you want, but we're going to get what we want. But that ability to stand up and engage in horse trading seems to be utterly absent among the GOP leadership. So if the Republicans hold on to the House and gain the Senate, I hope they put in some leaders who actually will lead the GOP, provide a very positive alternative to what we have now, which is basically socialism versus diet socialism on the part of the Democrats and the GOP, and put up a bit of a fight. I mean, look, it may come at the end. It may be that they don't have the votes to do what they want, but at the very, very minimum, what the GOP ought to be doing is raising these issues, talking about them, debating them, force the Democrats to make uncomfortable votes, and at least get them on the record as saying, okay, I favor the insurance companies over the taxpayers, or embarrass Obama by, in fact, agreeing with the GOP on something like that, on the health care bailout. But instead, they don't even vote on these things. The Democrats pay no political price, and the taxpayers continue to suffer and go home and look at their wallets and wonder why they're so light.
And we've actually talked about spending a lot recently, and it's very fitting to bring up this topic because we've been talking about how we refer to the youth, refer to the children, as you mentioned in the article, but actually that group is growing quite old. What we call youth are adults now. We see millennials being adversely affected by a poor economy, which is a big part of what's depressing the economy is the debt. So do you see any ways to take steps forward on addressing that sort of issue and the urgency of it when it comes to youth voters?
Well, a couple of things. One is that if you want proof of the fact that Obama and company did not sit down on hard chairs and think about how Obamacare works and how it all holds together or doesn't, consider the fact that they need, I think it's something like 40% of the people signing up for Obamacare to be between 18 to 34 for the economics of the thing to work. So of that 18-year cohort, exactly half, 16 years, 8 of those 16 years between ages 18 and 26, those people who should be signing up for Obamacare were told, don't worry, you don't need to be on Obamacare, just stay on your mom and dad's plan. Now, if you open a restaurant and you said to half the potential people who'd come into your restaurant, oh, don't eat here, just go eat at that restaurant across the street, no restaurateur would do that, no business would operate that way. And yet these people did not think for about 10 minutes that, hey, we need these people, so let's create some mechanism or some inducement for them to sign up. No, instead you tell half your vital audience, we don't want your business, stay on mom and dad's plan.
Right.
Just amazing. I think it's absolutely incumbent for free marketeers to talk to young people who are getting out of school, moving back in with their parents, not working, being told by the Democrats, well, you ought to be happy because you've got coverage on, you can stay on your parents' plans, you're 26, you can get food stamps, so, don't bother working. That is sad and pathetic. I graduated from college in 1986, and everybody in my class either went on to grad school or they got work, and many of them were quite prosperous very quickly. It was not hard to find work back then, and I feel very sorry for my younger friends who get out of school and they're either unemployed or underemployed. Many of them are very sad, very dejected, and they're wondering whatever happened to the American dream and are they ever going to have any taste of it. And the GOP and conservatives and free marketeers ought to be talking to young people and telling them, look, you can have a better life than what you have now. There's no reason for this to go on forever. And the first step is to get the socialists and the liberals out of government, send them back to the universities where they can teach and study and do research, or maybe they ought to go sit in their mom and dad's basements perhaps, and let the rest of the economy go back and grow and thrive and let people actually pursue their dreams, passions, and do so in the commercial sector and in the markets and actually make something productive of themselves and get this country moving again, because we're basically sitting on our butts as a society. Not good for anybody, and it's particularly not good for young people.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Well, in the few dwindling months we have in Congress before they permanently go on the campaign trail, what do you see beyond taking some votes on Obamacare that can be done to demonstrate to the American people that they're serious about turning things around? I mean, is this tax reform draft, for example, that Chairman Camp put out, something that could be at least a discussion starter for trying to untangle our horribly complex tax system? Are there other opportunities? Well, they blew it with the Farm Bill, of course, but perhaps
Totally.
there are other areas in federal spending that we could revisit over the next few months.
Well, a couple things. I would, if I were John Boehner, I would, on Obamacare, take, rather than have a giant bill such as Tom Price's bill, he's an actual doctor who's got a reform proposal. There are other proposals. The GOP House needs to pass something. They all say, look, we have lots of ideas. Great, pass something. What they should do is pass small things such as, okay, all those in favor of letting Americans buy insurance across state lines, let's call the yeas and nays. Number two, all those who want medical malpractice reform as part of the formula, all those yeses and nos. Who's in favor of universal health savings accounts, for example, and you have a vote on that. If you do that in the House, you now force the Democrats to vote on these things, and some of them will vote with the GOP on it. What you do is you unite the GOP and you split the Democrats. At that point, you can pass 10 or 12 of these individual items. They'll pass the House. You send to the Senate, where they probably will die or not even be brought up for a vote. And then in the fall, the GOP can say, look, these 10 or 12 items constitute the GOP's replacement for Obamacare, and give us a GOP Senate, and we will pass it through the Senate and put it on Obama's desk. And if Obamacare is falling apart as badly as we think it will continue to do, maybe at some point Obama actually passes to sign some of these things. Who knows? So that's the first thing I'd do on Obamacare. Secondly, I would have as many actual victims of Obamacare, people who've had their plans canceled, people who like their plans but couldn't keep their plans despite the lies that Obama said, people who like their doctors but couldn't keep their doctors despite Obama's lie that they could. Bring them to Capitol Hill, present them in press conferences. Every time Boehner and Cantor and these other people talk about Obamacare, they should have victims of Obamacare right there, regular American men, regular American women, to talk about their stories and say, look, Harry Reid may say these are all made-up stories, these are all lies about people who are victims of Obamacare. Well, I'm not lying. Here's what happened to me. I lost my plan. I lost my doctor, et cetera. And let's see their faces and hear their stories. And then one other thing I do on the spending is this penny plan, which is a great idea, which is in the year 2014, we spend 100 cents on the dollar. 2015, we spend 99 cents on the dollar. 2016, we spend 98 cents on the dollar. So every year you cut spending by a penny. And you say to the managers of the various federal departments and agencies, okay, you need to cut 1 penny out of your budget this year. And these guys can't do it, they ought to be fired. And if they can, and they're forced to, I think they can walk around their buildings and say, okay, maybe this person should retire now. Maybe we can turn off the lights at 5:15 when everyone goes home. Maybe we do something different on vacations or pensions or whatever. And slowly but surely you'll see the spending curve go down, and particularly relative to where the upward curve is supposed to go. Pretty soon we're saving ourselves real money and also delivering government services in a more efficient fashion. Finally, on tax reform, I think Dave Camp's proposal is a good start, and we ought to talk about that as a talking point. I prefer something much more radical, which I call the 0, 10, 100 plan. This is my plan. And 0 refers to the number of deductions. No deductions. 0. No deductions. No mortgage deduction. No business meal deduction. No charitable deduction. No deductions whatsoever. 10 refers to the tax rate. 10% tax. What did you make? Send us 10%. We're not interested in deductions. We don't care about the house you bought. We don't care about the lovely business meal you had. Just send us 10%. And 100 refers to the number of people, the percentage of people that need to participate, which is everybody's in. Not half the country paying taxes. Everybody pays taxes. So if you're a person who made $5,000, you're going to send $500 to Uncle Sam. Now, you may get more than that back in benefits. You may get thousands and thousands of dollars worth of Medicaid and food stamps or whatever it may be. But everybody has to have skin in the game. Everybody writes a check. Everybody pays taxes. It's everybody's government, not the government of half the people who pay taxes while the other half of the people don't pay and are really not participating in the finances of the American government. I'd say the same thing with corporations. There are many companies that don't pay taxes. They ought to pay taxes. They ought to pay 10% of what they made. And if they had some lovely meals and they bought some equipment, that's lovely. We just want to know, what do you make? Send us 10%. So 0 deductions, 10% tax rate, 100% participation. That's my tax plan. We could have it all written in about 2 pages and take the other 70,000 or 72,000 pages of the tax code and just pulp them and turn it into, maybe into toilet paper. I think it'd be an improvement.
I think that would be a plan taxpayers would love to see. Unfortunately, we're keeping them abreast of what's going on with things like internet sales tax, and that might be the next thing that we have to worry about rather than some sensible spending cuts. So really appreciate you joining us today, Deroy.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you, and thank you very much to the National Taxpayers Union for all that you do to talk about these ideas and these issues and keep American taxpayers aware of all the things that Washington, D.C. Is doing for them and more likely to them on a daily basis.
Oh, and thank you for getting the word out there. And once again at nationalreview.com, definitely check out Deroy's article about the national debt.
Thanks very much. Bye.
For fans of the National Taxpayers Union Foundation's Taxpayers tab, there's some good news, and we have Dan Barrett of the foundation back in the studio to give us an update on a big redesign, which is expected to be live in the next few weeks.
Thanks, Doug. Yes, because of the generous donations of NTUF members, we've been able to update the Taxpayers tab layout for the first time since we've come out with the Taxpayers tab about 5 years ago. And so, yes, in the coming weeks, we're going to have a streamlined design that will make it easier for people to share Taxpayer tab articles and NTUF information through the Bill Tally Project on social media, to forward it to their friends, and to view it online.
Yeah, and there's a lot of great information in the tab, but sometimes it is a little dense because there is so much info in there. So this will hopefully make it a little more accessible for everybody so they can get the most out of it.
Exactly. We've also added a bottom line segment so that if you don't want to read through all of the dense verbiage, we have it at the very end of each article. For example, this week we did an article on repealing some United Nations voluntary contributions by the United States. And so the bottom line is just very succinct, saying exactly what the bill would do and how much it would save.
Excellent. So we'll be looking for that. And if you have not subscribed to the tab, definitely sign up for NTU and NTUF's email lists at ntu.org. It's time for the outrage of the week. And this one, the travel thing, it just never seems to be brought under control.
No.
Whether it's the First Lady who's off in China without the media enjoying a trip out there, or other officials. We've had all sorts of, all levels of government have scandal around travel. And this one in the Washington Times is about federal officials flying first class and using government jets for personal jaunts. Pete talked about this with Sinclair Broadcasting. So Pete, take it away.
Yes, unfortunately, we continue to hear these stories now from the Government Accountability Office saying that in a follow-up to certain evidence that had been presented by, for example, the Washington Guardian, that federal executives had racked up about $11 million worth of travel between 2009 and 2011 aboard aircraft, and the travel was primarily for personal use. Well, not much has changed since then. There is a massive lack of transparency, not only in the record keeping of the costs, but also of the trips themselves. Part of the reason being that a lot of agencies don't feel compelled to report this stuff. They say, well, these were classified missions, and so we don't have to bother submitting any data to the General Services Administration or anyone else who might track this kind of activity. Well, that's a major problem, and GAO itself said that's a pretty flimsy excuse. The other GAO finding, of course, in a separate investigation, had to do with federal lawmakers as well as other officials taking first class and business class tickets and trips when coach class would do. This is just a recurring problem. It amounts to tens, maybe hundreds of millions worth of dollars. When you take a look at the huge federal budget, $17 trillion national debt, wouldn't seem significant, but here is the significance. People can directly relate to it. Most of us have flown. Many of us take regular business travel. Many of us are required to account for every single penny we spend on these trips to our employers. Members of Congress and other high-ranking officials don't seem to live under that standard, don't even seem to care about it. And that's why this is the outrage of the week. That about does it for this edition of Speaking of Taxpayers. Remember, folks, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And we speak truth to power every week here on Speaking of Taxpayers. I'm your co-host, Pete Sepp.
And I'm your co-host, Doug Kellogg.
So long.